Here at Phillips, and this is my colleague Carrie Leibowitz, who does the contemporary editions. And we're just so thrilled to have, obviously, such a wonderful panel tonight to honor the hot-off-the-press publication of the Frank Stella Catalogue Raisonné, the updated and complete version of all of his graphic works. And 315
you got it.
Entries. Some of you have seen there's books that are for sale over here in the corner, and we are so fortunate to have Frank here to sign them. And afterwards, Frank and Rick Axsom, the author, will be stationed in the table in the back for signatures.
How long?
So we just wanted to quickly introduce our wonderful speakers tonight, part of this celebration. First, we have Mr. Jordan Schnitzer, the president and founder of the Jordan Schnitzer Family Foundation, based in Portland, Oregon. Jordan has been collecting prints voraciously since 1988 and started the foundation in 1997.
I started working with Kelly when she was 12 years old. At Butterfield.
And how many pieces would you say you have in your collection?
90. Well, we just bought 3 at the Sotheby's auction that's going on right now, so now we're 9,503.
And please look at the Jordan Schnitzer Family Foundation website. You're doing wonderful things supporting post-war and contemporary graphics and loaning your huge, beautiful collection out to so many great institutions in the States.
Thank you.
And then next we have Mr. Richard Axsom, the esteemed author of numerous Catalogue Raisonnés, all within the print world. Klaus Oldenburg and Ezra Kelly and
Terry. The first edition of the prints of Frank Stella.
Right.
1967 to 1982.
That's right.
And Terry Winters.
Yes.
And you are the senior curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Madison Museum of Contemporary Art in Madison, Wisconsin.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I've been given the task to introduce Frank Stella, which seems really superfluous to everyone here. Everyone, I think, knows who I'm introducing. So I'd rather just say thank you for being here. The show at the Whitney, I think, was a reawakening for so many people. It was so exciting to see. I think we all just want you to keep making work and make more prints.
Viva la prints.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, we're on. Well, I was going to say to Frank, and he knows he has been busy, but he's been very busy. He just returned from the opening of his Whitney retrospective at the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth. And earlier this afternoon, he received an award for excellence in the arts, which was given to him by the Appraisers Association of America at a luncheon. And now signing the book, and also a conversation or a back and forth between the three of us. We have appeared, the three of us, together on stage before, so we're beginning to get a bit comfortable with one another and what we have to say. I want to thank Kelly and Carrie, of course, for proposing and for organizing this very special event. So to proceed with the conversation between us, I'm going to get things started by speaking to Frank, but also giving you just a quick overview of his printmaking. And that is, Frank began to make prints in earnest in 1967 at Gemini GEL in Los Angeles, a publishing workshop that opened the year before, opened by Ken Tyler, master printer, by Sidney Felsen, and by Stanley Greenstein. And I think Sidney may be in the audience here. I haven't seen him yet. Frank made prints there until 1974, when Tyler went east and opened Tyler Graphics Limited. He would continue to work with Ken until Ken shuttered the shop in 2000. And in looking back then over that, because he's not made prints since, and he may tell you why he hasn't, is that over the period of nearly 3 decades, and working with other workshops here and there, he produced, as the number was cited, over 350 editions. So, a question to Frank about Ken Tyler. And talking with Ken Tyler in preparation of the Catalogue Raisonné, I asked him about his working relationship with Frank. He said over the years the two had collaborated so closely and got to know each other's needs so well that all they had to do was grunt. And that's a true sign of intimacy of mind here in making some extraordinary prints. So I'm going to ask Frank if you could speak to your relationship with Ken, the nature of that partnership, and some of you perhaps have heard or read Robert Hughes' characterization of this relationship between Ken and Frank. He called it one of the great partnerships in modern American art. Frank, could you speak to that?
Well, I didn't know it was a great partnership. I basically did what Ken told me to do, which was we were trying to make prints. And sometimes it was, and I didn't know actually anything about prints, and I stayed innocent. I'm quite proud of that, actually, although it sounds kind of stupid. But I didn't really learn anything about printmaking in, I don't know how many years it is, but we did manage to make prints. And the interesting thing about it was that it didn't make much sense to me in the beginning, and it doesn't overall make that much sense to me now, but we were able to do a lot of things that expanded the way I thought about everything, not just about printmaking, but it certainly made a very big difference in my work in general or at large.
Well, you see behind us 4 prints by Frank, 2 Sensually Variations from the Sensually Variations series. Also, Inaccessible Island Rail from the Exotic Birds, and The Whale is Dish, the large print behind me from the Moby Dick project. Many of you are aware of how very innovative, experimental, successfully so, Frank and Ken were in exploring new ways of making prints. And it's somewhat suggested here the arc of that. I mean, up until the early 80s, Frank's print medium of choice was lithography, with additions here and there of screen printing and also with screen prints in their own right. But in the early 80s, he and Ken began working with new kinds of templates, new ways of printing, with handmade paper. The Whale as a Dish, blending screen printing, lithography, linocut, collage, marbling, and hand painting, is quite a ways away from what was up until the early 80s a relatively straightforward handling of lithography and screen printing. My question to Frank is, how did that happen? How did you move from the earlier period to the print behind us, the monumental multimedia print?
Well, it started in a sort of simple way, which was that we were working, actually making pieces, and we were doing a lot of relief printing at the place called Swan Engraving, Mr. Swan. And we used etched aluminum. We were etching magnesium, which mainly were plates that the company made them in a commercial way for making plastic tablecloths. But magnesium is easy to etch, and it etches very deeply, and it was working quite well, and it allows for quite a bit of freedom. And then while we were working there, we were also making pieces. We were actually building pieces for actually, I think the circuit pieces, and the they had to cut out the metal first and then make honeycomb sheets with it. This was building for the paintings, for the relief paintings. And then the process left plywood in the bin on the way to the garbage was a bunch of plywood panels, and they were routed. They had the traces of the routing of the shapes, and so I just saw them as wood, and I asked Ken if we could print them as they were, which as a wood block. And once we had that kind of freedom between the relief printing and the wood block and things, and we had the scale, it changed, and it wasn't. I didn't have to make an image that was going to become a print. So a lot of these images are reproductions in a way of paintings or other things that I had done, not that I had did, but which were, and then they became something else, and actually that eventually led to the way things worked in the paintings too. But it's basically starting from a wood block, which was a found object actually, but it was a found object made from outlining shapes that I had used.
And you've talked about how these new ways of making prints and using handmade paper, which is a very different substrate from printing on than traditional printmaking paper. The shop would, with a stencil that was created designed by Frank, would, while the paper was still wet, would squeeze dye and color stain the paper itself. And the paper, they were thick like carpets. And then you have other levels of print media working up, often embellished with here collage and hand painting. And it gives you a very, very textured print. You've talked about the stamped qualities and the relief. Did the new kind of textured relief must have interested you?
Well, it wasn't so much interested me, but I mean, it was different from working with lithography and working on plates and then having it printed off the plate, because the relief printing is, inherently textural, and the ink reacts. You get a lot of different kinds of bite, a lot of different things happen, and it was quite freeing in a way. I mean, you didn't have to worry so much about the whole image. I guess a simpler way of putting it would be that you were working in such a way that the image could evolve as the process evolved.
Right. Well, I want to turn to a topic which interested Tom Crow today in his lecture at the luncheon, and it's an issue that came up in the late 60s. As I was coming through, there was always the wonderful titles of Frank's prints and paintings, which no one seemed to pay too much attention to, because at this point, and to quote Frank himself, what was the print and what was going on and what was its expressiveness? Well, what you see is what you see, and that was a formalist way of considering a work of art of abstraction that should not reach out beyond itself, should not make references outside of itself as pure color and form and the delight taken in the orchestration of those elements. But then you had all sorts of titles that, were they conveniences? Were they sonic? Just they sounded so interesting. But then we all began looking a bit into it, not we all, but those who found it interesting that there were titles that refer to, for example, the two Singerly variations. They're beautiful in their own right. You don't need any more. But what happens when you find out that Singerly names a Muslim city in the ancient Near East that had a city plan of circular and concentric circles? Something goes off. I mean, there's something added to another sensuous dimension. Or the exotic bird print. What happens, and the wonderful punning upon templates from drafting tools like French curves and boat curves and rail curves that rhyme with feather, okay? But then you look a bit more closely at the titles, what happens to your response when the names, the titles of the paintings and prints are all endangered and extinct birds? So things open up. But then there's also, and I want Frank to speak to this, there is an attraction to or working with narrative and literary content. In the prints with illustrations after Elisizzi's Hedgatia, Calvino's Italian Folktales, and of course Moby Dick. So I wanted to ask you to comment on your interest in referential titles and literary content and how that came about.
Well, it sounds a lot worse than it is. But basically, it's a straightforward idea about abstraction. Abstract art, one way or the other, even now, or probably forever, stands in a relationship somehow to non-abstract art, we'll put it that way, generally speaking, representational art. And the point of the idea about abstraction is to find a way to make it a little bit freer, a little bit more expansive. But this has a historical edge to it. I mean, abstract painting, by and large, although I think it can think of so many exceptions, particularly Kandinsky, by and large, abstraction in the 20th century anyway meant geometric abstraction. And so the painterly abstraction of, say, what happened in New York from 1935 to 1955 or whatever it is, you know, abstract expressionist painting didn't translate, maybe because they weren't interested, but it is interesting that it didn't translate into anything like fantastic graphic work. And, you know, I never actually thought about that, but the point that I would make about narration is that it's an idea that the shapes and the forms can in some way move and relate to each other in such a way that it's something like a narrative. So they're interacting with each other, and you can imagine that it's possible that it's a narrative experience, that a story is being told one way or another. However, it's between abstract elements. So I don't know how that plays out in the end.
Yeah, you've talked about like the Italian folktales, that they're not, and I don't think any of us think that we're looking at illustrations, right? Literal illustrations, but that the Italian folktale prints and paintings, there was something about the play of forms, the collision of forms, and the rhythms, and sort of the happy-go-lucky antic qualities of the imagery that was suggestive of to the rhythms and patterns and expressiveness of the folktales themselves. So, does that sound okay?
Yeah. No, but I was thinking that the one thing that we didn't touch on, or the basic, it's not a problem, but the basic idea about printing has been always reproduction. So, and it's not just that they're editions, but they're reproductions of work that has existed before and exists in a new, in a different form. But largely the idea, and I think this is where Jordan comes in, it was meant to have to reach a larger audience. I mean, that was the point of it. And I think it's still important. But one of the problems with that is, in some ways, from the artist's point of view, is that you're limited in a certain way to what you have done. And so there's something about printing and particularly working with Ken, which was kind of loose in a way in which we could try things because we didn't have a goal and we didn't have an image that we were trying to improve or make accessible. Actually, the prints are not about the normal point of reproduction, which is accessibility. I mean, it was a challenge in a certain sense. You could make an image which you could say reproduce 100 times, and you could make an image that nobody liked. And it was a new image, or an unproven image.
Well, speaking of Jordan, Jordan Schnitzer, without whom the Catalogue Raisonné would not have been realized. And also there is a traveling exhibition of Frank's prints, a retrospective of the prints, which Jordan also had an extraordinary role in. Jordan, you're not what I would call a smorgasbord collector. You know, a little bit here, a little bit there, 2 Oldenburgs, 1 Judd, 3 Stellas, and let's continue collecting. Jordan collects in depth. I mean, his wish and ambition, which is mine secretly, but I could never realize, is that, yes, I would like every print that Frank made. Now, you don't yet, okay?
Neither does Frank.
But, I mean, Jordan had a sufficient number of Frank's prints that I could curate a retrospective exhibition. I could create a checklist from his collection. So, Jordan, I wanted to ask you about collecting in depth. I mean, it's almost a philosophy. I mean, it's guiding your collecting. And I wanted to ask you about that, why that's important to you. And of course, I want to ask you what drew you to Frank's prints.
Well, as many of you know, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and my mother, when I was in the 1st grade, went to the Portland Art Museum Art School, and 3 years later opened up a contemporary art gallery in Portland, handling artists of Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. So while I now collect all of these kind of folks, I always preach at the 100 museums I've been to across the country with exhibitions from our collection, the importance of everyone supporting their local artists. When she closed the gallery, there was an exhibition of contemporary prints like this at the museum, and I thought, wow, I'd like to start buying some of these. And one of the first ones I bought was a purple one of Frank's. The first thing I'd ever seen of Frank Stella's was in 1973, that Eskimo curler that was in the Whitney exhibition that was bought by some wonderful people in Portland for the Portland Art Museum. And once I saw that, I'm sure like every one of you here, how do you not just have this passion and this addiction for everything this brilliant man does? So I started buying a few prints and a few more and a few more, and the museum at the University of Oregon, where I'd gone to school, asked if they could have an exhibition. I said, sure. And it was so exciting to go in and see the work, but suddenly that joy was surpassed by sharing it. And I realized that you all live in the art center of the world. And for most of you, in terms of this audience, I think I often ask, when was the first time you went to the MoMA or to the Met? And you probably can't remember if you've grown up here. But for a lot of people around the country, they don't get exposed to this kind of work. So I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I put together the passion I have for buying the work with a huge exhibition program that gets work to university museums, regional museums, and we've had shows at the big museums too. But when you get to Omaha and Jacksonville and Savannah and Boise and Salt Lake and Laramie, Wyoming and Springfield, Missouri with Kara Walker shows, Frank Stella shows, Donald Judd, and you see the faces of these grade school kids that we fund programs, as many tours as the docents can deal with, we'll fund all the buses coming in. And just as you've all been transformed, the reason why you're the choir here, and this is one of our leaders, you just don't know what dreams and goals can occur when you're able to take these kinds of creative folks and expose them to people across the country. So it's just been very satisfying. So therefore, in terms of my collecting, I'm really building, in essence, a public collection. So that wonderful curators like Rick Axsom and Jennifer Farrell's here that's now at the Met. She did a Jasper Johns show at the Fralin Museum at the University of Virginia, and then came up with the idea of doing a Richard Serra show. It's there, going to the Nasher. It's just so much fun. So if we collect a lot in depth, we're able to really offer to curators and museum directors, as you said, a smorgasbord of picking what they want for these various exhibitions.
Yeah, I think the idea of the reproduction and the accessibility is interesting, since we happen to be in an auction house. But one of the things that makes it work is that I think about it a lot, thinking about the shows and everything, they're easy to ship. The cost, the costs are kind of realistic, and I think the impact is quite great. I mean, in relationship to the cost, and it doesn't have to be such a big deal. And in a certain way, major works of art are kind of tough. They're not as accessible probably as they seem, whereas prints and the notion of paper, and of course now people print on plastic or whatever, still it's at a scale that relates to partly to your body, to your hands, and you can come up to it, and it's not actually, I think it's not threatening anyway, it's inviting. And a lot of art is a little bombastic, and I could be talking only about myself, actually, but that notion that you can approach it and have a feel for it as well as a visual reaction to it, I think is important.
You know, oftentimes I'm asked at these exhibitions, someone will say, well, why don't you collect originals? And I'll say, well, these are all limited edition originals. They ruin the plate, the wood block, whatever. But are you asking me why I don't collect the paintings? Yeah. I said, well, even if I had the money to buy some $60 and $80 million Warhol paintings, we've had some incredible collectors in this country that have already done that. That Meyerhoff collection, Ovitz, Pinot, Arnaud, the Fisher collection in San Francisco, Eli Brode's collection. I mean, incredible patrons of the arts. And if you had Eli Brode here and the late Don Fisher here and had them sort of discuss who had the best 2 Frank Stellas or 2 Lichtensteins or 3 Warhols, that'd be fascinating to listen to. But in terms of these audiences that aren't used to that level of art, when a curator can come say, do you want to do a Warhol show? And I'll say, I have 800 Warhols. What do you want? They're all framed. Can we get them there in 2 weeks? With the Frank Stellas, we have 250. We'll get to the full 315. And furthermore, as we've seen, without commenting on the kind of price escalation for a lot of those paintings of Warhol, Lichtenstein, whatever, I mean, other than the Modern Museum and those level museums, to put on a show that maybe has $3 or $4 billion of art, the insurance cost, I mean, and getting it all there is impossible for other than the biggest museums in the country. And that leaves an awful lot of space and an awful lot of fabulous museums that otherwise couldn't see this kind of work. And I guess what I'd also say, at the risk of not upsetting you, I said to Ellsworth Kelly about a year ago, and we were lucky to do a Catalogue Raisonné with Rick Axsom on Ellsworth Kelly, and I called him up, and I said, Ellsworth, I've just got to tell you, I mean, I think your paintings are wonderful. I said, I think your sculptures are incredible. But I said, your works on paper are off the chart. And I was thinking in terms of your work, because I think you're so humble anyway. When you walk into a room like the Madison Contemporary Museum, and you see 120 of these works on paper, that are some of the most brilliant collaboration with Ken Tyler and Frank Stella. It is just overwhelming in its delicious complexity and this creative, the best of the human spirit coming out in these kinds of designs. When you look at them, you think, my gosh, how did he come up with, why would you do that? Incredible. They're just incredible, your works on paper. And I love your paintings too. Okay,
well, but I think that, you know, making an impression is a kind of interesting idea, and what you work on, actually it's pretty hard to make an impression on a piece of canvas, or even more so an aluminum, a honeycomb aluminum. You can drill holes in it and do all those kinds of things, but the paper is really receptive. It's a different kind of material. It does have a tradition, but actually handmade paper, which has, of course, been around for a long time, I think Ken sensed that it could be, you know, that it was kind of, in a way, limitless as a surface and as a way of working for the artist. I think of Jim Rosenquist's pieces and some things that I did. It's really, it's a very freeing and a very inviting surface to work with. And one thing that also is kind of interesting, because we talk about reproduction and that they're, you know, you've done something 100 times or something. But if you have a big enough piece of paper, people get tired of it. But actually, most of the big prints and with handmade paper, they are really all different, and a lot of different printers, and a lot of people work on them. And so nothing is really exactly the same, and they change quite a bit on their way through the edition. And things that happen, the changes somehow make you want to change in a way, or you react to the changes, and you react to what others can do, or what the limits are. And it turns out that all of the limits, as far as my experience goes anyway, are really not limits in the end. I mean, if you have an idea of where that limit is, and you want to do something that extends the possibilities of what you were doing, generally speaking, if you can push a little bit, it's there.
In terms of your creative process, I've never asked you this. Do you?
It's good that you didn't.
The question, what I'm getting at, and I'll ask the question in a second, is when do you know when to stop? That, okay, it's done. Do you wake up in the middle of the night and you're working on one of your spectacular paintings, you work with Catalogue, and suddenly it dawns on you, boy, I want to put some more orange here, whatever it is. How did that work, and how did you say, that's done, next one?
Well, I don't know. I do it. Everybody more or less does it their way, but it's a tradition. And I don't know how far back the tradition goes. But as far as the immediate history, or my immediate history, which is basically post-war American painting, there was a place called the Club on 8th Street where the artists met pretty regularly, and that was one of their favorite topics. How do you know when it's finished? And, you know, the discussions, when you read about them and everything, don't seem to be that enlightening. But they had, you know, the results were good. And it is interesting, too, I think, thinking about that one particular idea. You don't hear about it that much anymore. Everybody has a pretty good idea when they're done, or when they're tired of it, at least anyway. And you get a lot of, you get more finished products, it seems to me, in the last 20 or 30 years than I experienced before.
Let me ask you another question. You've talked before about the artists that were senior to you, and how wonderful most of them were to you, Ellsworth Kelly, or Lichtenstein, whatever. Why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because that'd probably be fascinating to people as to, you know, who sort of, reached out to you.
I don't know how fascinating it is, but the reality of it was that it was smaller. It was a relatively small world. And so, you know, if I were a young artist today, you know, I'd be busy on my phone, or I'd be talking to my pal in Kuala Lumpur and sending him some images of what I just did. But that's a kind of communication, which I guess is okay, because I don't know how that's going to turn out. But it's a lot different from going to the bar and drinking and arguing, because you're closer physically in every way. And the result, I think, is this is, you know, probably on a certain level doesn't make much sense, but you're closer to the work of your own, and you have a different feeling about the work that somebody else is doing. So if you're worried about when it's done, or whatever you did that day, you can compare it with somebody else did the same day. I mean, I think of, you know, people like, I don't want to go on with this, but I mean, in the 60s, I mean, when you read the histories, as it were, everything is broken up into units. So you have color field, pop art, second generation abstract expressionism, minimalism, and I guess, I don't know, I've forgotten the word for outdoor art, but anyway, digging a trench. But anyway, that was all going on at the same time. And, but it was still a very small group of people, and it wasn't anywhere near as separate as it turns out to be in the retelling of those events.
And who were some of those artists that...
Well, I used to see a lot of Larry Poons and, say, John Chamberlain, actually, whose work I loved. But most of the times when you visited John, I mean, his studio was pretty much an open place. You know, all you got to see was a lot of slot car racing. They weren't overly, you know, overly serious at a certain level.
Well, just, I mean,
I mean, after all, I mean, you know, John, it wasn't much for John to make he was criticized quite a bit of it for being a de Kooning-esque sculptor. But, you know, he did the same job on Ethel Skull's hair. So, I mean, it came out one way or the other.
You know, I was just going to make a comment on, I mean, this notion of small community, and there's a much larger community where, you know, there's connectivity, and you're not seeing everyone, and you don't know everyone, is, and this is a shout out for prints. I mean, the print world, bless all of this here, is a small world. And people in the business, the dealers and the collectors and the curators, Print Council of America, there's such an extraordinary sense of community, and you sort of you know people, and there's a pleasure in that. I think very similar to what Frank is talking about. So another bid for the importance of prints, and Jordan, your enthusiasm, I think, makes you, among other things, one of the great ambassadors for prints, and your programs and your exhibitions and your publishing ventures. And I was going to, just a quick question about that. Thank you for publishing the books. And I've come to know Jordan, and I wanted to ask you about what excited you about publishing. I mean, this particular raisonné, the Kelly raisonné, the process of producing a catalog raisonné has its ups and downs. It has its challenges for author and for publisher, and sometimes for artist. I just wanted you to speak about the pleasures you've taken and the challenges in producing this catalog raisonné.
Well, first of all, one thing I think is so exciting about works on paper is the collaboration. And, you know, post-World War, as Frank was saying, we can go back to the 1600s, and Albrecht Dürer, I mean, they're etching, I mean, been around for a long time, but post-World War II, starting with Tamarind and all the publishing houses, Gemini and I mean, Crown Point Press and on, there was an explosion of creativity, and it allowed artists like this to be paired up with a Ken Tyler, and the two of them together created that, you know, that 1 and 1 equal like 5. I mean, you look at these works that have happened, and it allowed artists to be able to push the envelope in ways that never been done before. So that is so exciting to me to see, because what this is all about. I mean, think about the room we're in right now. How appropriate. I mean, to sit here right now and listening to them and looking up at those Donald Judds. I mean, doesn't get any better. You know? So the collaboration of the works to begin with. Okay, and then, as I already said, I developed the exhibition program. But then there's also an importance to have a record, an academic record of the work of these folks. So you know, we hooked up with Rick Axsom, and we did the Ellsworth Kelly Catalogue Raisonné, 850 pages, and then the Letters to Ellsworth book. I'd already done the Catalogue Raisonné for John Baldessari and a book about John's work, and then we got a chance to do the Frank Stella, and we're now going to be starting one on Terry Winters. So for me, and I think for all of us in here, this room, I mean, I'm sitting here right now, but I mean, to be in this room with these two gentlemen. Rick Axsom is, in my opinion, probably the foremost critic, writer about artists of the last half of the 20th century, now the 21st century. And just listening to you earlier talk, I mean, he's the quintessential teacher. And you just want to sit and just listen and listen and listen and learn. And then the relationship he's developed with the late Ellsworth Kelly, with Frank Stella, you see a magic when they're together, like two grade school kids that now are older that have grown up together. And the trust they have, and just that partnership. So the ability to help facilitate the magic of the genius of Rick Axsom, and then the amazing Frank Stella, to result in this book that others can enjoy, and the auction houses now have a full catalog to to use for their work. Just how lucky to be in that position to do that. And it's an absolute labor of love. It's a way maybe to contribute back a little bit for how much joy. How do you, when I look at this work, I have one in my office, I look at it every day. When you look at this, I mean, how lucky we are to experience this art. And it's a way of giving back a little bit.
Yeah. When I think of the Catalogue Raisonné and the whole issue of documentation and the kind of academic weight that it gives to the things, if you can lift these things, I think of this one unsung hero here, and that's the Attorney General. When he decided in probably about 1975 that we had to really have a more serious documentation of the printmaking process and everything, which led to Ken Tyler trying to drive everybody crazy with documenting every little thing that happened on a piece of paper.
Right. And adding to that and amplifying that is that you have some sense, if not before now, that Frank's prints, as they evolve, become more and more complex in wonderful ways. And the printing sequences, which are in Catalogue Raisonné, where you're given the various runs through the press. Well, the days of 2 runs from 2 aluminum plates, run 1, blue, plate, run 2, red, plate, that has evolved to the point that with this Raisonné and with Frank's printing sequences, which can be 156 runs, when we were compiling the Raisonné and putting the printing sequences together, it finally dawned on us that it would add like 1/3 the length of the book, and to its weight too. And so I'm proud to say that the decision was made to lessen the load of the weight of the Raisonné by putting the printing sequences someplace else. And you probably know where they are. They're in a cloud. And you can go online and visit them. And also, what I really love as a writer is, it's amenable. You can change with new information. You can't with the hard copy. And just one last note. It's an author's dream to have an erratum page online. So any mistakes you make, you can go up and change them. Well, this is a book signing, right? And I think we probably should be on our way to do just that. We were going to speak 15 minutes, and thank you, and thank you, Frank.
Yeah.